Well, it is that time of year as things heat up on the court and on the field, giving us storylines for days from Little League to the pros. It's time to talk about what makes everyone tick and what we see in sports today. Welcome to Locked On Women's Basketball.
You are Locked On Women's Basketball, your daily podcast on women's basketball. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Happy Monday, friends. It is August 11th, 2025. And oh, yes, mid-August means back to school. So for everyone, we wish you the very best. Hi, everybody. Missy Heidrick, National College Basketball Analyst and National Basketball Correspondent at The Next. Thank you for making Locked On Women's Basketball your first listen every day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. We all wake up every morning, and the headlines in sports are abundant. Action in the WNBA, MLB highlights, college football's right around the corner. College basketball recruiting news is filling our feeds. But the beauty of sports is the chance to peek behind the curtain a little bit into a college basketball program and an MLB clubhouse in the psyche of a professional tennis player. Today, I'm so excited to have someone whose work I have read for many, many years, a native of my neck of the woods right here in the Midwest of Kansas City, Rustin Dodd, a senior writer for The Athletic, and The Peak, which is the new vertical covering sports leadership, personal development, and success with The Athletic. He joined The Athletic in 2018 after 9 years at the Kansas City Star, my hometown paper right here. Rustin, good afternoon. Thank you for being here on Locked On Women's Basketball. How are things out in New York? And as we hit this August grind that is all things in the sports world.
Yeah, Missy, thank you so much for having me. That was a very nice introduction. Things are doing great. I'm glad to be here.
Awesome. Well, I want to start maybe just a little bit of your journey from beat reporter, in the grind every day when you were with the Star, and then you make the move to The Athletic. And what drew you to that platform? What was it that said this is a place where whether you could stretch your legs, all the things you want to do as a journalist, but maybe a different side of sports that you found there?
Yeah, I was hired at The Athletic in 2018, and I was still covering Major League Baseball at the time. I was covering the Kansas City Royals, and they hired me to cover the Kansas City Royals. But I think, The Athletic was growing at the time. It was sort of a young sports media company. Yeah. It was kind of expanding all over the country at that point, and it really did have a lot of ambition and a lot of, it was trying to grow. It was trying to really sort of, had a lot of aspirations to kind of be among the biggest sports media companies in the world. And I just found that to be really a great opportunity. I think it's a sad thing about media in general, but it's really hard to work at a place in 2025 in media that feels like it's thriving or growing, or that it's it's trying to do new things, or it's trying to innovate, or it's trying to kind of push forward. A lot of times it feels like when you work in media, you're kind of trying to survive, honestly. Absolutely. And so that was something that was really appealing to me. And to kind of along those lines, I worked at The Athletic covering the Royals for a year, and then had the opportunity to move to New York, still covering sports for The Athletic. And, that's a rare thing in, this business where you can work for one company and, take a job, but in a totally different city. That rarely happens as well. So those were the kind of things that brought me to The Athletic. And then I've been able to sort of carve a niche there where I've been able to cover a lot of different sports, which has been also something that, I don't know when I went there if I thought about this, but I've been able to, cover Super Bowls and cover the World Series, and cover the NCAA tournament and do all these sort of things at a place at the same place. So it's been a wonderful place to work.
Well, I'm going to do shameless plugs all around this episode today. First, I want you to go see all of our women's basketball coverage in our newsroom at thenexthoops.com. And then you're going to park yourself over at The Athletic and find all of Rustin's work and that of his amazing colleagues there as well. The interesting piece to me that as I, over the course of the summer and then reading your work and seeing what you guys have done is this launch of Peak, which is something different and unique. And as I said it just a few moments ago, it's sort of this new vertical that The Athletic has adopted, that you guys have created, about sports leadership and personal development and success and what that looks like. And it seems as though it's also then really given people a different look at sports and at how, whether it's a professional tennis player or someone in a major league clubhouse or a coach with exorbitant experience and success, how they approach everything in their own daily lives. Talk a little bit about how Peak came to be and what drew you there.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So one of my editors is a longtime sports journalist named Craig Custance. He's based out of the Detroit area and was an NHL writer for a really long time. That's kind of where he kind of came up in the industry. And he's at The Athletic in charge of kind of new projects, new initiatives. And about 2 years ago, I might have the timeline correct, he wrote a book called The Franchise, which is essentially about NHL front offices, sort of how they work, kind of the principles that they follow, their methods. And it's a lot from the more kind of leadership side of things. It's like what drives somebody who works in a front office. And so he was sort of had an interest in those kind of stories. Another one of my editors is a longtime Athletic writer and editor named Jason Jinks. He's actually based in Kansas City. And he also we all kind of came together and we kind of love stories about successful people. I mean, I think everybody does, right? I mean, this is a classic sports journalism kind of story. You write about the star player, you write about the coach and his methods, and those sort of things exist in all sort of sports journalism coverage. We wanted to do those stories in a sort of more kind of intentional way, right? So sort of approaching kind of how do we tell those stories in a very kind of, specific, where it's not just, we're not just setting out to write a story about Andy Reid and part of his leadership philosophy is going to obviously be in the story. We want to write, how do we write about Andy Reid's leadership philosophy?
Right.
And so it's this like that little bit of a twist on it. And then the more kind of that was sort of the idea. And then the more I've kind of just written these stories, I oftentimes tell people I cover success. I often say I cover like leadership.
Yeah.
Something I didn't think about until I started writing the stories was I also kind of cover behavioral science, because so much of leadership or decision making or motivation or all these things that we like
Mike, one question to you, Rustin, as I think about how you think behavioral science and about looking at people and what that leadership is, because we can talk about coaches, we can talk about successful players, whether it's in the college ranks or the professional ranks. But do you think leadership is something that is ingrained in folks that you talk to in some of these stories, or do you think it's something that they're learning over time?
It's a great question. I think it's like one of the ultimate questions. People, I think it is something that can be learned. I think there are natural things that when it comes to leadership that some people that are innate, that some people are gifted with them, whether it's a sense of charisma, it's ability to connect with people. We often talk about emotional intelligence, or sometimes people will refer to them as soft skills, to be able to really like relate and connect with people. I think some people naturally have those gifts, but I think, if you talk to a lot of people, you can kind of refine those gifts, and you can be a little bit more intentional about the way you approach things. And so I think there's ways that you can learn to be like a great leader. I think the sort of personalities that oftentimes, like, we think about like personality driven leaders or charismatic leaders. I think some people have, or they just have more of that charisma naturally for whatever reason. And it's hard to match that, but that's not the only type of leader that, you can be. And when it comes to like building relationships or the various ways that people really connect and lead people, I think you can learn to be a great leader.
I absolutely agree. And I think you see that in sports, and we see it all the time. All right. In just a moment, more with Rustin. And what drew me to wanting him to come on this podcast today was a story he wrote last month, in the month of July, about the world of NIL and college basketball and coaching. How are coaching and how are they changing in this new world? A little bit of insight there. We'll be back in just a second. Well, we've all been there, logging on early, waiting forever for concert tickets to go on sale, only to lose your spot for a show you've been dying to see. Live music should be about making memories, not dealing with stress of ticket shopping. That's where Game Time comes in. Game Time makes getting concert tickets faster and easier than ever. Prices actually drop as it gets closer to showtime, and you can save up to 60% off with their killer last-minute deals. Ever wonder what your view will actually look like before you buy? Well, with Game Time, you're going to see it. No surprises. Take the guesswork out of buying concert and show tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Hi, everybody. Missy Heidrick. Welcome back to Locked on Women's Basketball. So happy to have Rustin Dodd of The Athletic and Peak, their vertical that covers sports leadership and success and personal development. All right, Rustin, I teased this just a moment ago, and part of the reason why I was like, I've got to talk to him is because he wrote this great piece back in early July about how NIL and the transfer portal have changed the way college basketball coaches lead. Now, you had a chance to talk with some of the top men's college basketball coaches in the country for this piece. And for all of my women's basketball folks out there, I'm going to tell you this, ladies and gentlemen, absolutely 100% applicable, because they're all dealing with the same thing on a daily basis. Talk to me a little bit about how you came to think about approaching the ever-changing landscape that we're seeing in college athletics, but from this perspective, because we know it has to be changing what these coaches do on a daily basis.
Yeah, I think so. I approached this story originally from the idea of that I think most people, when they think about NBA coaches, they think of NBA coaches kind of leading and coaching in a different way than college coaches. Now, I'm really talking in generalizations here, so there's going to be exceptions, of course. But you think about NBA coaches, the players have a lot of power. These are they're stars, they're highly paid, they're millionaires, and the coaches are oftentimes have less power than the players in terms of that dynamic, and so that makes them very much kind of on equal footing. And you oftentimes hear about, players coaches and sort of in the ways that NBA coaches sort of handle, relationships and egos and personalities. it's a slightly different form of leadership and coaching. In college, because, traditionally, I think when we think of college basketball coaches, men's or women's, we think of kind of more like authoritative leaders, right?
Right. Yeah.
People who are, it is their program and they have, their identity is all over it, whether it's, Mike Krzyzewski or Pat Summitt or Tom Izzo or Bill Self. The classic one, obviously, on the men's side is Bob Knight. That kind of has shifted, obviously, but there is still that sort of like, this is how we do things. I'm going to tell you what to do. And I think that style of coaching in college has always been, for the most part, again, I'm generalizing, but that's sort of the successful model. And I think, that is, if you talk to coaches, they don't want to change necessarily the way they push kids and the way they try to get the best out of their players and the way they coach kids. But I think that the two things that have really kind of changed things are, NIL, kids are making money, but even more than the money is kind of on the side. It's the transfer portal, which is essentially like free agency, where the kids have, they can leave, either for more money or for, a better environment. And so I think there is it requires a kind of a change in the ways coaches are, building relationships or connecting with kids, that to kind of retain the kids on their rosters. And I think it's required maybe a little bit of a shift, and I think oftentimes people think about this as being sort of generational. There's always sort of the people like like the kind of guy that's like the get off my lawn, where it's like, oh, it was so much different back in the old days or whatever. Yes. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think coaches are always hard on kids and they always push them. And I think it's, I'm not sure that is the case, but I do think nowadays, in terms of the kind of power balance between coaches and kids, it requires a different type of leadership, where coaches have to be more relationship driven, and they have to sort of build that, the ultimate cliche, but it's a pretty good one, is that, coaches don't really know how much, or they don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. You hear that one.
Yep.
And I think that is sort of what the story was about, where, and you've seen a lot of programs going into the NBA ranks to hire either head coaches or assistant coaches and adding that kind of element. And I think it's a good recruiting tool. People want to prepare for the NBA. But I think those people also have an understanding of how you need to sort of, build a roster on the fly and connect people. And there's some things that can be gained from that kind of perspective.
No, I think you're absolutely right. One thing you hear all the time, I hear it, practically daily within the college basketball world, is we've got to re-recruit our own roster. We have to be able to, you got to retain what you have. The portal changes, that it makes it like free agency, where I can go wherever I want. And if I'm not happy here, the grass is probably greener, may or may not be, but they think it is. On the flip side, we've also watched, in the women's basketball world, we've watched successful head coaches of Power 4 programs, i.e. Lynn Roberts, a year ago, step away and said, no, I'm going into the professional ranks because maybe I just don't want to deal with some of that. So I think that there's going to be this new balance that coaches have to find, especially at the Power 4 level in all sports, which is, can you change with the times, or is it just say, I don't want to mess with it, and I'm just going to say, screw it, I'm going to the college, I'm going to go to the pro ranks, and I don't want to deal with all this other crap that comes my direction. I feel like the pendulum can go both directions, don't you?
No, definitely. I mean, and we're kind of talking about, I think, often two things at once, and it makes it really challenging for college coaches, because when you're coaching college kids, there isn't a development aspect, right? Like these are still really young kids, and they're still developing into kind of the best version of that they could be. You're also paying them money to come to your school, and so those are like two different things. Whereas like at the professional level, there's a transaction happening where you're paying players, but you're not necessarily like, you want to get the best version out of them. Of course you do, but it's not like there's not like a huge development curve happening where you that is part of what your mission is.
Yeah.
And I think it's a really challenging thing for coaches to deal with both of those at the same time. And not to say that, that's kind of the job and that's kind of the landscape as it is now. But I just think those two things at once are, I think would be a difficult job for anybody.
Well, and my last question to you on this topic, as we kind of see this ever-changing landscape, we know college athletics is changing, by the hour, and it's hard to keep up half the time. But also, as these top programs with high-level investment and high-level dollars and what they're putting into programs, that it's sometimes the person that's sitting in that head coach's chair, even though they may have been there for a long time or have had some recent success, the sustained success and being able to say, maybe they just can't get it done. Do you think we're going to see maybe more turnover at a faster rate because of all of these things coming to play and people trying to figure out how do you lead in that top position?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think from a just a standpoint of are more coaches going to leave? I think what we're going to see, and this is a little bit goes into the leadership aspect, but it also goes into maybe sort of a more of like a management aspect.
Yeah.
We're going to see like programs are just going to have to sort of evolve in terms of how, whether it's, a lot of coach or programs are hiring, quote unquote, general managers now, somebody to sort of handle the roster, that component of it. And, I think we're seeing recruiting still important, but the ways in which you recruit is a little bit different now in both the men's and the women's game. So oftentimes those skills that you need to recruit are maybe different than the skills you need to be, a great, X's and O's basketball coach. So oftentimes that maybe, at the college ranks, maybe that opens the door for more people who are, great X's and O's coaches. And those are the kind of the skills that they have, but they've never really been the charismatic leader type that can really recruit a roster and put that together. But maybe you don't need that anymore. So that's another component that may be kind of changing the skill set that we need. But I still think that it's not like things are going to change that drastically. I think, I mean, the transfer portal obviously offers a lot of headaches in a lot of different ways. But the skills that you still need to coach, building relationships, connecting with kids, motivating, those are the same skills that coaches have always used. I just think that there is an inherent sort of shift that happens when the power dynamics change, and when the money has changed a little bit, those power dynamics change. And if the coach and the coaches that can adjust and recognize sort of that those power dynamics have shifted, but that relationships are still the most important thing in coaching, I think those are the coaches that will have the most success.
No, you're right. Power shifts and power changes we're seeing in the college, and it happens every day in the pros. All right, in just a moment, from clubhouses to the gridiron, what makes the greats in sports tick? Hi, everybody. Missy Heidrick. Thank you for joining us here on Locked On Women's Basketball. My guest today, Rustin Dodd, senior writer for The Athletic and Peak, their vertical profile about leadership and development and success. Rustin, I'm here in Kansas City. You're a native. You covered the Royals. You saw all of that success. Back in 2023, you and Mark Dent, also a Kansas City native, you two co-authored a book, Kingdom Quarterback, and a look at Patrick Mahomes, at some of the history about the Kansas City Chiefs coming off a Super Bowl win. You've seen some of the very greats and sort of what that looks like. Someone like Patrick Mahomes, his type of success. You've written about Scotty Scheffler, Coco Gauff, all these different things and these different players and athletes. As you think about some of the top at their game, what do you think is one of those things, or what does make some of these people tick at maybe a whole different level than the rest of the universe?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think whether it's Patrick Mahomes or Scotty Scheffler or Serena Williams, that they're driven by something deeper than rewards. They're driven by something deeper than, sometimes people refer to it as external reward. Like people are motivated by achievements, right? So motivated by material things or whatever, like the trophy, like that kind of stuff. I don't think that's what motivates Patrick Mahomes. And I think what's fascinating when you look about athletes like that, like him, then the natural question would be like, okay, so what motivates him? Mm-hmm. And I think it is something that we cannot explain. Yep. It is this deep core competitiveness that athletes have. And to mention Scotty Scheffler, I was fascinated by something he said before the British Open about a month ago, where he spoke to something that I think a lot of athletes feel, especially the ones that are in that echelon, where he talked about how motivated he is to win, and that he used the word like he becomes almost like a sicko. Like it is just, it is the most important thing in his life, to win, every tournament, to win golf majors. And then when he does, he actually feels like it's not as good as that he thinks it's going to be. Yeah. And I think that is a really interesting idea, first off, on a number of levels, but I think it speaks to how deeply these people are motivated, that it's I feel like I'm not even explaining it because it can be such like kind of a mystery, but they're motivated to be the very best on a level that is sometimes like is hard to comprehend.
No, I think you're right. And that makes sense to me, because I think we see professional athletes in every sport, whether it's individual or team sports. Like you said, a Serena Williams, a Coco Gauff, a Scotty Scheffler, Nelly Korda on the women's golf side, someone like Asia Wilson, reigning MVP in the WNBA. I mean, just last night, she's the first player in the NBA to ever have a 30-plus point game and a 20-plus point rebounding night. Like that just doesn't happen very often, but those people are motivated at a level that I think most 99.9% of people just don't quite understand. I want to flip the switch with you, because I loved the piece that you wrote back in May around the Women's College World Series, Softball World Series with Sue Inquist, who one of the most successful college softball coaches in the history of the game. And she talked about that leadership principle for her. And I think we talk about athletes and what makes them tick, but coaches have the same thing, right? And the really good ones are the ones that find who they are and stick to the principles. And that's how they continue to have sustained success. Talk to me about that conversation with someone like Sue Inquist, because I think she's a trailblazer in women's athletics, but also just hit it on the nose as to what it takes to motivate and to lead young people. Yeah.
Well, the one thing that stuck with me about that conversation was kind of a theme of a lot of stories I end up writing, which is the theme about failure. And at the core of sort of her coaching philosophy is sort of what she calls, I think I might be misquoting her slightly, but it's something like failure response. Basically, it's like how quickly can you deal with failure, and how quickly can you move on? And that oftentimes it sounds like a really simple thing, but like from a chemical, I was doing this other story recently where they were talking about this, where there's literally, when you have a failure, there's, neurons firing in your brain, that are responding in certain ways that are causing you to feel that those emotions that you feel with failure, that are happening. There's like a part of the brain that has, these chemicals. So it's not just like, there's reasons for this emotional response that we have when we fail. But Sue Enquist was talking about how, at the core of her program was finding ways to drill their players into being great at responding from failure. And, whether it's any sport, there's so much failure, in every game and every practice. And it's sort of, she even said, there would be times where they would have a drill where they would know that the players were going to mess up. Like they would maybe just hit ground balls as hard as they could at them, or there'd be certain, like they'd almost have a failure drill, and they would almost have a routine where you made a mistake, you pause for a second, you tapped your chest a few times, and then you moved on. And it was almost conditioning them to sort of just move on after failure. And she had a couple of other things that she said that I thought were really interesting in terms of, another thing people have, she said that comes up a lot in stories is the idea of nervousness or nerves or anxiety. And there's actually been research done on, what we think about being nervous or anxious before competition, that if we tell ourselves, no, I'm not nervous, I'm just excited. Like if you literally tell yourself before something, whether it's a speech or something you have to do that is making you anxious, you say out loud, I'm not nervous, I'm excited. That you can reframe those kind of emotions into something a little bit more positive. People always use the term like, oh, just harness that energy or channel that energy, and that
it'll be better. It'll be great. Don't worry about it. Yeah.
I always kind of used to laugh when you hear that. Like, okay, like how do you do that? But
yeah.
If there was a professor at Harvard that I spoke to that did some research on this about 10 years ago, and she did studies where I think one of the examples was like karaoke. She studied people doing karaoke, and maybe it was public speaking, but that they actually, their performance improved and they had fewer anxious moments when they would literally tell themselves, I'm not nervous, I'm excited. And so I don't know, those were the two things that stuck to me about Sue Enquist, just the responding from failure and sort of and kind of embracing the nerves that happen in a big moment.
Well, and I think that is applicable to probably most of the individuals that, whether it's coaches or athletes that you have profiled and that you interview, and you think about where they lie in this kind of spectrum that we see in sports, which then brings me back to my shameless plugs of all day, which is to go see us at thenexthoops.com for all of your women's basketball coverage and newsroom. And then please go to The Athletic, see Rustin, go to Peak, see all that he has done, because it is amazing. All right, without giving away too much before we go, sir, what are you working on and what is next on that to-do list for Rustin Dodd?
Well, that's a good question. It's not so much that I worry about giving the ideas away or whatever. It's more about jinxing them. But I do have some U.S. Open, some tennis coverage coming up at the end of the month, which should be fun. And then a few college basketball stories kind of around the corner after that. So there may be some smaller ones in between, but I'm going to be doing a lot of tennis at the end of the month, in the end of the month. So looking forward to that.
Well, and there's going to be some fantastic tennis on display, and the Open is one of the best things to see, and it's right in your backyard right there in New York. Rustin, I so appreciate you, sir, and thank you so much for your time today. And I want to thank everybody out there for watching and listening. Please come back, see us here at Locked On Women's Basketball all week. For more coverage, more news, it'll drop. You'll find us at thenexthoops.com. Thank you for making Locked On Women's Basketball your first listen today. For your second listen, find the Locked On NBA podcast where there is no off season. Doug, Matt, and Hayes keep you up to date. Contract negotiation, rumors, everything you need to be the most informed NBA fan. Find Locked On NBA on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Happy Monday, everybody. Happy reading. Get out there, see it all for yourself. We will see you next time right back here. Have a fantastic day.